So I'd like to invite you to talk about a trip that I made on a very bumpy and very uneven playing field. So 3 years ago, I was an Ashoka Fellow in Berlin, working in South Africa and crazy places like Afghanistan, doing girls' safety and community development projects. I had a great team, and I was enjoying my life. And then Washington University in St. Louis called me up and said, would you like to be the new chair for this social entrepreneurship and innovation program? So I went from wearing a tracksuit and carrying a backpack to supposed to be a new chair at a research university in St. Louis. Most of my life grew up in Canada, but then spent time in Berlin, which, as you guys know, social market democracy, extremely, lots of people want to live there, public health care, excellent schools, and a civil service that prides itself on its efficiency. And then I moved to St. Louis, which is a Rust Belt city, declining population, decaying infrastructure, decaying public schools, public health, and just general challenges. And those of you who know the region, we basically have 87 little municipalities that can't really decide on much, right? 87 police forces, 87 school districts, 87 sets of local politicians. So, okay. And then the next challenge being that before I was working, basically trying to raise money for our projects and raise money and pitch for money for earned income. And then the new job, new opportunity, was about creating pipelines for student, faculty projects, as well as community projects in St. Louis. So while I was used to being on one side of the desk and putting up all my numbers and explaining how this great new venture would make money, now I was supposed to try and find all the money, try and make all the pipelines. So I'm curious, how many of you in the room are responsible in some way for raising money for your own programs? Okay. So one of the challenge I realized very early on is that when you say pipeline, the universities were pumping out all sorts of engaged students who are interested in doing something. They can't necessarily run a business. And then you have community members who often can win a little prize, but $5,000 doesn't really get you so far. So I was curious about how do we actually get to be talking about some real money? And in St. Louis, like maybe in many of your cities, there's a lot of philanthropy, okay? But what's the problem with philanthropy if you're talking about 6 or 7 digit amounts of money? Strategic planning, thank you. Can we get all of those people to talk and decide on some priorities? No, okay? So very well-meaning, very committed to their community, but they're very fickle, right? Anybody work with a fickle philanthropist? Yeah, okay. So I'm supposed to be advancing these two. Let me do that. So that's St. Louis. That's the St. Louis of my mind while I was being recruited. But to be honest, it's even better because we've got some awesome people, but that's later in my talk. So anyway, so who are the other people who put money up for things? So you've got philanthropists, you've got foundations, but when you think entrepreneurship and putting money together, where does it normally come from? Lots of good ideas. Okay, corporations, what else over here? Well, louder. I've got the mic, I can't hear you, you have to be loud. I was saying the same, corporations. Yeah, corporations, okay. I'm thinking of a very specific form of a corporation, normally, in this case, a venture fund, right? Venture capital, right? And it's so funny because we're in social entrepreneurship, we don't even think of venture capital, but venture capitalists put money into promising ideas. Okay, do any of you know what an accredited investor is? Have you heard the word accredited investor? Okay, you've heard the word, Samantha. Okay, what's an accredited investor?
Usually someone with a lot of money and a lot of assets who is able to get loans.
Yeah. Well, probably they're not trying to get the loan. They're trying to put money into awesome people. Unfortunately, accredited investors look like this. Okay, you have to, in order to qualify as an accredited investor, you need to be making 200 grand yourself, or 300 if you're married, so nice to be that power couple, and have $1 million in assets without your house, okay? So I'm teaching in social work, social policy, and public health, and cross-appointed to the business school, okay? So none of my students are making 200 grand. None of the staff who I'm working with make 200 grand. Maybe a few of the faculty across the field at the business school are making 200 grand, right? But who at your university is making 200 grand that they qualify for this? Like small amount, right? The trustees maybe, okay? So what does that mean? It means that we're getting all these great ideas for evidence-based programs from the faculty, from the students that we want to fund, and not fund with $5,000, go have fun money, but like 500 grand. And then when it's proven and your RCT comes through, then 5 million. Like let's be serious, because we're dealing with bigger problems, right? And if you're going to be doing capital investments, you need more money. So we have people at the university who know how to make an evidence-based pitch, who know what we need the money for, and people in the community who would better use the money, but they're not the ones who qualify to be part of some of this commercial banking space. And so the people who are making decisions are people who are way up here, probably not making their money as a social work professor, but in some other well-regarded profession. And so I kept thinking, how do we get the money from campus to fund the sort of things that we want to do on campus? How do we get the money from the community to fund what the community wants to do? So that took me to thinking about, I'm obviously not the first person to thought of this question, right? And this whole idea, okay, everybody here know who Bernie Sanders is? Yay, Mr. I've just applied to be president. What was the awesome thing about his campaign? What was one of the things that people talked about how he got his money together? Yeah, so rather than like 5 big PACs, like the Koch brothers and the Koch cousins and the Koch dads or whatever, not like 5 of them, but like each giving $1 million, but like 1 million people giving $5, right? And so like, how do we think about that? Right? Because the whole crowdfunding business. Okay, so I'm thinking about how do we have more citizen engagement, and how do we have the students on campus who are thinking about economic justice to realize you don't have to wait till you're making tons of money to actually be involved in the investing side of it. You don't just have to put your passion behind something or what you're curious about, but how do you actually get it done? And then being that it's St. Louis, one of the main challenges is, of course, for the African American population. It's one of the most segregated cities in the United States. As I was researching this and talking to people about, like, how do we get this money together? How do we get around those gatekeepers? They're like, you should read more about the history. And of course, I started to. And then back in 1967, the year that Dr. King was shot, but there was huge demonstrations in St. Louis because these banks would take deposits from black businesses, but not give any loans. And was there a single African American person working here? No. So again, totally being pushed outside of the investment space and the opportunity to get loans to build their businesses, let alone mortgages. That's a whole nother talk I'd be happy to give. But after a year, so the pressure started going on, and they're like, you should hire some African American people. If you want our business, you should give us jobs. And then the bank had the audacity to say, we can't find 4 people who are qualified. Okay? So not that we should all be so surprised by that. But anyway, so starts it. A year or so of demonstration, a much more radicalized group of activists in St. Louis, and a bank that had a few African Americans working for it, but not really solving the problem. Then we move to pictures like this, right? This is back after the killing of Michael Brown. That's also a long and bit complicated story, but needless to say, young man's killed in the street, left uncovered for 4 hours. People in his community are, with reason, frustrated and mad, and not just about that. And then an incredibly militarized police response, also due to a lot of burning of private property. So there's people who can better inform you about all of the background and history to that. But this is also part of the history of St. Louis. But then coming out of this and the immediate days after, then you had a lot of people who are making the connection between racial equity and economic empowerment. So just like I'm trying to think, okay, how do I make sure it's not just like 8 people in the entire city making decisions about investment? They're making the same argument. They're like, you can't expect everything to be peaceful and to work if our businesses don't grow, if we can't have home mortgages or renovation loans in order to grow, if we don't get proper jobs, right? So what I started thinking off in terms of like, how do I get like a runway of 5 million for some of these, larger projects? These are just like really day in and day out problems for a lot of our fellow citizens. So then moving from that, we had a lot of community groups coming together, talking about their challenges, which turned out with the Forward Through Ferguson report. So I know some of you are coming from cities like New Orleans, like in Maryland and Baltimore and so on. I really recommend people to look at this report just for its breadth in terms of looking at a wider response to racial equity. But one of the most important, well, I shouldn't say it's the most important, but something for me in social entrepreneurship that I noticed and cared about is that alongside all of the other priorities about court reform, about police, about schools, about pretty much everything that St. Louis wasn't doing yet, but was the point that they needed a fund, right? To create a 25-year managed fund focused on racial equity. So again, sometimes people are like, okay, I'm in finance or I'm doing social investment. That's not really right on the front lines. It is right on the front lines because once the activists and other people clear some space for you, then you need to have money to grow these projects and not have a door slammed down in your face. So I was excited that other people were saying, how do we get that, right? And then, of course, we're here talking about uneven playing fields. I like how Samantha set it up, but I do think it is a little bit about taking power from some people. We are growing a pie, but we are also saying, stop pushing me off the pie. Let's start prioritizing things which have huge catalytic value in the longer stream. So while Forward Through Ferguson was just back since 2014, the federal government realized pretty quickly back in '73, after a lot of work around civil rights and all of the activism, that the banks were basically not serving everybody in their community. Okay, surprise. That's what happens when you're like white and upper middle class. You're like, banks are there to help your dad build a sawmill. Well, for some people, for most people, they're there to say you don't get a car loan or only at like 22% or something. And so the Federal Reserve created what's called the Community Redevelopment Act. How many of you had heard of that before now or are actually doing stuff with them? Okay, are you actually doing anything with them, with the CRA? Not yet. I've got ideas for you. Did somebody else put their hand up over here that's with the CRA? Yeah? Are you doing anything around their money?
I'm working on a financial inclusion project at our university, and we're looking at connecting bankers and working with the local bank, and we talk about the CRA.
Good. This is why I'm glad you guys are in the room, because I've been hearing at the conference about lots of great ideas about how people are doing things. Also, there's colleagues from the University of Houston who are funding community small businesses and so on through the CRA. But let me kind of walk you through how I learned about this, because it was I've only been there for like 2.5 years, and I'm like, are you serious? But they're basically forcing banks to give money into exactly where we want to be putting money, i.e. these like low-income census tracts. Okay, so the banks have to do it, either grants, loans, services, etc. And they are through the Federal Reserve, so everybody's kind of got their area. Good if you're on the East Coast, but there's one that's actually in St. Louis, so I was able to, use the advantage of being a big university in a small town and like sit down with the people organizing this and try and help them think about it. But even more, these are all the CDFIs. So a CDFI is a community development financial institution. I didn't know what they were either. Now I sit on their board, so that's how life works. But they get together all of the community credit unions, all of the banks that lend to generally like minority entrepreneurs, minority contractors, and so on. And they are sort of specialized on like a more difficult not difficult, but like underserved, or people who don't necessarily have the credit scores in order to be able to get conventional banking. And so I heard about CDFIs, and so I thought, okay, I'll go meet with one of them. And so I thought I'm meeting a banker, right? I went to the Federal Reserve, and of course it's beautiful and marble and, doors which are, I don't know, like 30 feet tall or something, and security and all of that. Cops who like whistled me back because I didn't give them my phone when I went through the metal detector. So I'm like, okay, it's going to be like that. Anyway, but I walk into one of the local CDFIs, and the fellow who's like running it, turns out that his training in community banking was as a community organizer, and then otherwise he was a performance artist. So I'm like, okay, I studied political theory. But so the whole point was like bold ideas, right? And so it's, again, a totally different feeling about financial empowerment. But the thing that rocked me back in my seat is that because they're a bank, they can do a 4X on your money. Like he explained that if we invest in the bank or through one of the credit unions, like whatever, $5,000, whatever you're maybe earning as a staff member or junior faculty, that they can then lend $20,000 out, right? So imagine if all of the money that you're putting towards your own philanthropy or your goals, that you could actually get a 4X return on it, as well as having the fact that whoever you're giving the money to becomes much more bankable and it's much more easy. Hello, this is my colleague from the University of Houston who's doing an excellent project I mentioned. So I'm happy I want you to tell about your example later, okay? All right. So CDFIs, so I'm there talking to him and he's like, it's 4X. And I'm like, okay, that sounds great. And he's like, and then once we start talking with the CRA, with the bigger banks, we can leverage even further. And you'll start to get dizzy when we start to add in new tax credits and so on. So I'm like, okay, this is great. Why are we not doing more of it? And he's like, well, that's why I'm talking to you, because we should all be doing more of it. Okay, so here, this is the quiz part of this presentation. What sort of capital expenditures do you think get social workers and public health students excited? Like if you were a social worker and you got to build a building, what would that building be for? A clinic, okay, could be medical. Information? Education, that's true. This is one of those 3 times winner sort of things. So yes, those would work. Pardon me? Housing, also good. Say again? An incubator. Well, of course you love incubators. No, that one's not an incubator, but it's an incubator in another sense. It's early childhood education. Why do we love early childhood education? Why is that a 3-way win? It's good for the kid. The moms are still in working, right? And you have the education. So I say good for the kid, it's good for the child's health, it's good for the child's preparation for school. But we know if there's pretty much anything in a developed country that you're going to put money into, then early childhood education is it. Okay? And so this is one of my favorite examples, because this actually used to be a car, like a service station for cars and things, garage. And they had 2 of these sites being in low-income areas, doing early, very high quality, kind of Monterossi style early childhood education. Could they get a loan? No. Could they find philanthropists who are prepared to put up $2 million, which is a lot, to expand it? No, because we went back to the fickle philanthropists, or people who are ready to do it, but they didn't have like $2 million just to shake out. But with the CRA loan and the CDFI loan, they were able to get the money together. And so some of the foundations were able, just by making deposits into those institutions, basically guarantee $1 million loan with $250 of their own money, right? And so this is the stuff about banking I never really understood. When people talk about leverage, this is what leverage is, right? So I'm busy trying to raise $1 million for something, and they're like, you don't need to raise $1 million. As soon as you've got 200,000, boom, 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 that turns into this. So it sounds a little bit like witchcraft, but it's not, all right? So that's what I'm just trying to say. All of us who are kind of on the lefty side of the street and didn't want to learn about the money part, learn about the money part, because it turns this into this, like for real, So this is maybe the super sexy version, but look at all those happy kids. I didn't get a picture with like the hamster thing, but but this is what's possible, and this is capital investiture. When was the last time you ever saw in a grant proposal capital? You don't. And there's different ways. And my colleague from Houston will talk about her small businesses that get funded through this, but I was really excited about the capital investiture that could happen. So now I would like us to think about these sorts of people as accredited investors, right? Our students who are working on designing evidence-based programs and who know where the money should go and why and what sort of impact we're going to see, right? I'd like this room to be people who count basically as accredited investors. That you don't need to show up with $200,000 to have a voice on investment decisions. So I encourage you to take a look back at our little map. Whoops, I'm maybe not going to see it. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Tech hates me. There are definitely community development financial institutions within a bus ride of your campus, right? There's CDFIs that are focused also on tribal communities. That's one of the main places that they're actually working, is helping build up economic development. So I encourage you, thank you, I encourage you to just to think about how this could be something, working together with the funds your university already has, working together with some of your more forward-thinking philanthropists who want to create prize money and understand what a 4X could do for you. All right, so thank you very much.
Thank you.